And I am live once again. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi, and I just want to start off, of course, by reminding everyone here that if you have not liked my video yet, please do so. And if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please do. I'm trying to grow, and so I would like more subscribers. I also would definitely like to go on more podcasts and more lives in the future. And I'm hoping that in the new year I can do that and gain some more audience. But please, again, please like this video if you haven't already, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. In addition to that, today we are talking about an interesting topic that I wanted to go over. I have a PowerPoint here that I made, and we're going to talk about breaking down two different political ideas, which, of course, is liberalism and conservatism. I hope everyone enjoys that. It'll be a very sort of standard type of breaking down philosophy kind of idea, which I normally really like to do and have done in the past. You can go to my channel and look at my breaking down of theistic stances and non-theistic stances, as well as history and the philosophy of history and so forth that I've done. Of course, last week we did a history topic on the 1848 revolution, which I hope everyone found informative. And now we're switching back to the breaking down of two philosophical ideas, or at least in politics, which again I hope everyone does find informative. So thank you so much for that. You have one of my Mark Apostles here, Irish Mart. It's great to see you. Thank you for being on here. Thank you for supporting what I do here. And I know you were on Wednesday as well. Again, I hope you also found that conversation uh, interesting, which was can Scientology reform, or what would a Scientology reform look like? And it was just sort of my thoughts on things I've heard and stuff. And I think the basic conclusion from that one is if the Church of Scientology itself actually does reform, it probably will become more like the independent movement, which already exists. And whether or not that's socially helpful or personally helpful to people is, in some cases, subjective, although, in my opinion, it isn't helpful, but that's my opinion. And so I expressed that, of course. So thank you for being here, Irish. Um, yeah, and as I like to do before we get into the actual topic at hand, is go through some small talk and some introduction, which of course I like to do beforehand, as I mentioned, and sort of talk about this week and sort of what I did this week and so forth in life and whatnot. And first thing, sort of first is weather wise. I like to talk about the weather. Today was also 8 degrees, which I believe it was the same temperature as it was on Wednesday. So that's 46 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius. It was quite sunny. It was actually pretty nice today. I ended up going back to the Christmas market to get some mulled wine and some food. And then after that, I went to the supermarket, which was great. I actually really like going shopping and getting some fresh foods and stuff, and some fresh fish and whatnot, and so on. So I enjoyed that. Here we have another Mark Bossel here, Peter Anderson. I liked the pictures you sent of the torta. I know, unfortunately, I don't think you can FedEx me a torta, but if you can, I would like to consume that. Or maybe I'll just visit you in the US. And also, your DNA results were quite cool. It looks like you were sort of part Southern Europe and part, I guess, Western Europe. So that was kind of cool. I've done mine before. Um, I'm 65% Southern European, mostly from the Balkans, but also from Spain and Italy. And then I'm 20% Eastern Europe, mostly, of course, from Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania. And then also I'm 15% North African, including, well, total North African, West Asian, um, as well as Central Asian. So mostly from North Africa, from the Middle East, mostly from in and around the Levant, so in and around Israel, and that area, Israel, so forth, and then also Central Asia. So that would be Kazakhstan and so forth, in that kind of area. So I have a mixed family, even though 15% of me, people freak out. They're like, "Really, you look so white," but DNA is DNA, and that's what I am. And most of my I mentioned before, my Jewish heritage, 3/4 of it is actually Sephardic, and it comes from places like Spain and Italy and North Africa and West Asia. And then the rest of my place, I have some Eastern European Ashkenazi roots that would come from Hungary and Ukraine and Romania. So it's pretty cool. I was started doing that years ago. I did the National Geographic test first, and then I did 23andMe, and then I did my heritage. So it was a lot of fun. My first Mark Apostle, and the reason why Clearwater Chad is my first Mark Apostle is because he was the first person to subscribe to my channel, so he gets this honor, and he is here, so he's gracing us with his presence. Because after me, there's just Chad, and that's all it is. So thank you for being here, and do not worry, do not hesitate, do not get into an accident. Do we I don't want that, so do not worry about that. I'm very glad that you are here, Chad. Again, you commented before, I think last night, telling people to like the video, and so forth, which I always am very appreciative of. So thank you for all your support. And again, do not worry. Drive safe. I hope you're not eating pizza and driving, because that would be more dangerous than commenting and driving. Because, of course, if the pizza's good, you just kind of lose your focus. And we all understand that, right? But I'm very glad that you're here. And so, yeah, so nothing too much going on. And the past couple days since Wednesday is just Thursday, Friday, and now Saturday. And so, just walking around the city. Um, Transportation is cheap here. The markets are really nice, Christmas markets. The mulled wine is nice. I had some food. It's a little hard because it's a lot of non-kosher food, of course. A lot of pork is eaten in Hungary. It's the number one consumed meat, and all of our sausages and salamis and everything. But I did have some vegetarian stuff, which was nice, and they did have some fried fish. So I had some fried fish earlier, and then I also did have some Balkan food, which was nice, but mostly just bread and something called ayad or ajvar. Sometimes people call it, or ajvar or ivar. I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Which is that red pepper. It's like a paste dip, which I freaking love. I grew up on that stuff, so I had some of that yesterday. I don't really know, nothing too crazy here. Just chugging along, doing what I can. Oh gosh, well, I hope you're at a Delta Sonic, because if you're not at a Delta Sonic, I'm going to be very upset. Okay, Delta Sonic is my absolute favorite gas station in the Greater Buffalo area, because not only can you get gas, they have an amazing convenience store. Okay, it's like massive, and they can not only wash your car, but they do the inside. Come on, so I hope you are. Don't I don't know what they have up there, but and if you're not, don't worry. But yeah, I'm a Delta Sonic boy. I even had a membership for a while, which was funny. Um, Yeah, geez, one of these days I'm gonna have to get down to Buffalo. Jeez Louise. Too many references that kind of go unnoticed, I think. But anyway, yeah, so again, not too much for me. Just chilling, just planning ahead, moving ahead. And I will, of course, look at our schedule now just briefly for next week. And I will go over this before we conclude. So next Wednesday, which is the 4th now of December, I can't even believe it's December. I'm not going to have a poll, which I will remind everyone probably today, tomorrow, the next day. I'm not going to put a poll up on the community tab because we are going to do the many different varieties of history on the 4th. So I'm going to talk about things like economic history, business history, social history, political history, etc., which will be the second part of something I did a few months ago on the schools of thought of history. And so we'll do that on the 4th. And that was, of course, one of the two um, options on the poll from last week. And of course, Scientology Reform won. So I talked about that on Wednesday, last Wednesday. And we're going to do that. On the 7th, I'm going to probably do thinking of doing something on socialism because there's many different types of socialism and what that means and how there's the two colloquial uses of socialism. Some people get socialism and social democracy kind of confused, and I'd like to get into that. Why, like in certain places, like in especially the U.S. and Canada, why people consider Sweden like a socialist country. It's not, but whatever. So I'm thinking about doing that, going over that. And then maybe if I have time to go into nationalism, which I think would be interesting, but regardless. The week after that, of course, is the 11th. As I mentioned last time, it is the 1 year anniversary of the passing of our friend Doug Scott Kramer. So I'm going to talk about him, and I am going to talk about just our friendship and sort of some of the things that I learned about him and liked about him. And I hope that one does well. I'm going to be messaging some people this week to see if they want to come on or do some kind of mutual simulcast or whatever with us and talk about his life. And then after that is the 14th, which again, I think we'll do another breakdown. And then perhaps there'll be something on the 18th, but then we'll break for the holidays. So I'll go over this again after we're, just before I conclude it and then some time from now. But that's where we're going to stand right now. So yes, the chatathon is tonight, of course. It starts at 10 p.m. Eastern. Please go over to Clearwater Chad. When I wake up tomorrow, I am going to appear as everyone's favorite Pete Panzerotti. So I'm going to get up somewhat earlier tomorrow, which the chatathon will still be 6 hours behind. So I will be ready as Pete. Just in case you don't know, I am Pete Panzerotti. Pete Panzerotti is me. We are the same person. And I haven't done Pete for a little while, but I love doing Pete and I love doing the accent. I've got the sunglasses, I've got the flat cap, I've got that incredible 1970s Adidas jacket that I bought for 20 bucks at a what is it called? An outlet. And I will be ready to have my say with Chad. So go on to Chad. It starts 10 p.m. tonight. So that's just in a few hours from now, I guess, because it's around 3 o'clock on the Eastern time zone. So about 6 hours ish, give or take, right? Subtract about 15 minutes and go over there. And of course, we got to plug that event that's going to be taking place for a while. And yeah, we'll be a good cast of characters. So look forward to that. All right, let's get to today's topic. So before we get there, I'll just put up my slides here. I made a PowerPoint. And of course, the first thing that I want to reference is the fact that I get a lot of my definitions from a very similar source that I really love, which is philosophybasics.com. So www.philosophybasics.com. I hope that you all have gone over there. I've plugged them quite a few times when I'm talking about philosophical ideas and concepts. We've talked about different schools of Marxism, different schools of philosophy of history, and so forth. And I find that they are a really good, decent basic, definitions and a resource, for breaking down these kind of hard concepts. And that's what I kind of like to do. I sort of like to, do something similar. And so, at least for me, I use that one quite a bit. Philosophy Basics also has not just stuff on metaphysics, which we've talked about before, but of course ethics and so forth. We've also talked about the four schools of thought and philosophy. That was another stream that we've done, another live we did a couple months back. And so they'd have a whole school, whole section, I should say, on political philosophy. And I wanted to start off with the basics before we get off into, eventually we're going to do socialism. We can do nationalism. We can do Marxism. We can do anarchism. We can also do even like fascism and right wing kind of stuff as well. I just think that there's a lot that we can kind of break down. So this is sort of our to wet our whistle, so to speak, and this will give you all a very good indication of the type of PowerPoint that I'll do and the type of definitions. So the first thing is, because the PowerPoint itself will be too small, I'm going to go to full screen. So understand that when I go to full screen, I cannot see the chat, but I will periodically go and minimize, and so I can see the chat. And then we can talk. So every couple slides, I'll just interrupt and go back. So please let me know if you have any questions. Again, even though I might not see them right away, please type them into the chat if you have any questions, if you need anything elaborated, if you need more examples, if you have any comments, of course, any constructive criticism as well. I'm always open to those kinds of things. So please let me know. But I'm going to go full screen right now, and we're going to go to our first slide. So the first thing is there are many different types of liberalism and conservatism. So always like normal, like when I talked again a couple weeks ago about how do I break down ideas, we all need to have some kind of definition. All right. And in this definition, I don't want to just give the dry definition. I wanted to give some points on some characteristics of what liberalism means. So the first thing is just to go over just a very little bit of history on liberalism. Liberalism was founded by a number of individuals in the 17th, 18th century. One of them was, of course, John Stuart Mill. The other one was John Locke. And one of the big ideas behind liberalism came out of the idea that individuals, at least philosophically, don't belong to monarchs or authority figures, that there is this individual rights aspect. And so here are the first two parts of that. So, these are the heavy philosophy stuff, the actual political philosophy. So liberalism that was coming out of the 17th and 18th century was saying that number one, individual liberty, I should say, is the most important political goal, or two, it should be the most important political goal. So that means things like, who you are as an individual, and not your baron, not your landlord, not your priest, not your king, not your monarch, etc. So you as a person have these individual liberty. And along with that, there are individual rights. So, as an individual, you would have the right to property. Eventually, you have the right to vote and so forth. And those things would be individual. They wouldn't be owned by an authority figure, they'd be owned by you as an individual. And then the idea of equal opportunity. So, of course, we have this debate now in modern political philosophy between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. And one is equality, which we think of as equality of opportunity. Equity is what we think of when we think of equality of outcomes. But at least in liberalism, there's this idea that we all should start off in society at the same level. Now, of course, we can debate that whether or not it's true, and those who believe in equity, which is called progressive, and we'll get into that when we talk about socialism, um, sort of say that people need more of a they need more than just equal opportunity. So they need equal outcomes, which means if someone like me, if I can be very rich and successful in society, then so should someone who doesn't look like me and all this kind of thing. So it's again, it's getting a little bit into the weeds, but that's the idea between there. But at least liberalism would stress the equality of opportunity. So the government does have a role in liberalism. Of course, this is what John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and many others believe, which is that the government is necessary to protect rights. So we can't just have the rights as an individual or our property without something like the state or the police or something being able to enforce and protect those rights. They talk about extensive freedom of thought and freedom of speech. Those that are American, you'll know about the First Amendment. That is in itself a very enshrined document that was very profoundly influenced by 17th, 18th century liberal thought. The freedom of thinking, the freedom to believe, the freedom to assemble, and so forth, especially the freedom of religion, the freedom of thought as an individual. These are all emphasized by individual rights and liberty. And of course, they're enshrined in your First Amendment, in your Bill of Rights and Constitution. And one of the reasons was this because back in the day, under these absolute monarchs, there wasn't freedom of thought and there wasn't freedom of speech. It was the king's freedom of thought or freedom of speech, which also gave limited rights to the press. And we've talked about that before, especially last week with the 1848 revolution. There was, of course, limitations on the powers of government. Now, kings had to be, in a sense, subjected or cut off. They couldn't just make absolute decisions. They might have had constitutions. They might have had the rule of law, which, of course, is the next one. The rule of law, separation of powers, a lot of things that if you are American, you'll know from civics classes. And if you're not American, if you're from the UK or another country that's part of the Commonwealth or was part of the Commonwealth. You may know from things like the Magna Carta and so forth. So the rule of law just meaning that there has to be order in our society and multiple of those things. So separation of powers, and we call this in Canada responsible government and so forth. And a big part of liberalism was the advent of capitalism was a big part of it, which again is another thing. Once we talk about socialism, maybe we'll talk about the different types of capitalism. Of course, capitalism at that time is called classical economics, which focuses on people like Adam Smith, which is the market economy and so forth. But in later years, as we get to what's called a mixed market economy, sometimes called liberal democracy or social democracy, which is something that we basically have today in most um, high income nations, is that there's a mix of both privately owned and state owned enterprises. We do have privately owned businesses, they're regulated by the state, but we also, in some cases, will have state owned businesses. So that might own transportation or utilities or something might be state owned, but that's a mix. And then it says in a transparent and democratic system of government. And this is the idea of liberalism. Of course, liberal, if anyone here knows another Romance language, and I'm studying Spanish at the time, liberale means to liberate. And that's the whole point. That's the point of liberalism is liberation from these kinds of authorities. And we will get into maybe when I do the socialism PowerPoint some of the critiques of socialist critiques of liberalism. But essentially, I think for the most part, at least philosophically, a lot of nations like Canada, like the United States, like the UK, and the constitutions that have come out of a lot of quote unquote Western countries, and those influenced by other Western countries like North and South America, and even among Europe, have been, influenced by liberalism and liberal thought coming from these gentlemen like John Locke, who wrote On Liberty, and then also John Stuart Mill, who had the utilitarian approach, which is a whole other thing. But those two gentlemen are sort of sometimes seen as some of the two founders of what they call European liberalism. Yes, he did. Stuttering John got in trouble for reading the Magna Carta. I remember I saw it. And yes, I got +1 on subscribers. I know. Oh gosh, I know. I lost 2, I got 1. So thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. But yeah, poor Stuttering John there. He got canned for watching some videos on the Magna Carta. Magna Carta, by the way, a little bit earlier than from what I'm used to, so I only really know the basics of it. But the Magna Carta is an incredibly important document in the history of politics for sure. Okay, let's look at some now of the types, okay, of liberalism. So when I mentioned Locke and I mentioned Mills, or Mill, I should say, these are individuals that, because they were of the classical times, as I mentioned, classical economics, like Adam Smith, we would say that those original liberal thinkers, some of the founders of European liberalism, and there were others, not just Mill and Locke, there were others, but we would call these people or refer to what they came up with as classical liberalism, the first liberalism. So that is going back now a couple centuries. And classical liberalism is defined. It says it holds that the only real freedom is freedom from coercion, and that state intervention in the economy is a coercive power that restricts economic freedom of individuals, and so it should be avoided as far as possible. So this then deviates into another thing that I can get into later, which is called libertarianism, and really, the difference between a libertarian and a classical liberal is how much the government should do. Libertarians tend to believe the government should do very few things. Classical liberals think they should do a few more things. And then, of course, we can get into the more anarchistic view of what's called anarcho capitalism, where the government doesn't exist. And again, I can get into that. We can do a whole, libertarian um, minarchism, classical liberalism, etc. Kind of PowerPoint in the future. But essentially, that's the idea. It's a kind of philosophical idea. It says that any form of state intervention, especially in economic matters, is coercive, and they're trying to reduce coercion. Okay. Classical liberalism also favors laissez faire economic policy, which is minimal economic intervention and also minimal taxation by the state beyond what is necessary. So, of course, a classical liberal would say to maintain personal liberty, peace, security, property rights, the police, courthouses, what I say, the military, and some very, very few things, and then maybe some roads and maybe some hospitals. But beyond that, the government is obviously, they believe, too big because we have this thing called the welfare state or social democracy, which increased the size of the government and gave more, maybe more red tape or maybe more in the case of welfare. And it says the provision of welfare services by the state and the assumption by the state of primary responsibility for the welfare of citizens. So if we're looking at something that's more, classical liberal, we're looking at things like the government is in charge of the police force, which is public, firefighters, which is public, public courthouses and public court system, and of course public military. But then maybe some public roads because those are public goods, maybe some public utilities, maybe some hospitals, and so forth. And again, I can get into more of this when we talk specifically about libertarianism, but it's like the minimum within the minimum of what the government should do, and this is why it's considered to be, very 17th and 18th century, because at the time the government was not doing a lot. And when it started to do some things, there were some net benefits. And then by the early 20th century, when we had the progressive movement in America and so forth, and also in Canada, and then after World War II, we had what's called Keynesian economics, and the Keynesian movement increased government intervention, more welfare states. And then, of course, if you get into the 1960s with the Great Society, and we can debate all those, there's merits to some of them. There's still economists that say, it's a waste of money. There's still economists say that we need more, and we can talk about that when we get into libertarianism, when we get into socialism and whatever else. But that's the idea, at least, of classical liberalism. So these were the individuals that were kind of coming out of this sort of new age, in a sense, or this new era, in the 17th and 18th century, with all these different ideas floating around Europe, like capitalism, like liberalism, where the monarchs were really had a lot of power, and people. didn't really want that. They wanted more power to the individual. And again, we can debate those merits back and forth. I certainly like a lot of liberalism. I think liberalism has a lot of good values. I certainly think that it would be the closest to where I sit politically. Maybe not classical liberalism, but we'll go through that in a moment. It also doesn't matter. It's just philosophy. But regardless, we're also going to talk about conservatism. So we're going to try to be fair and balanced and neutral here and make no judgments. But I would say that certainly these ideas of not having power in the hands of a few, having individual rights and liberties tend to be the things that I enjoy in our society as well. One step forward, two steps back. Yeah, exactly, Peter. Hey, it happens. Okay, so the next one, oops, whoa, I went right by there. Okay, so this is called social liberalism now. This is more of the newer liberalism. Again, that's kind of coming out of like the later 19th century, early 20th century. When I think of social liberals, I think of people like Bill Clinton. I think of definitely think of a Canadian prime minister, one of our most notable, called Jean Chrétien, who was prime minister throughout the 90s. And this is really what I think of when I think of at least modern liberalism. So social liberalism, not socialism, pardon me, argues that government must take an active role in promoting the freedom of citizens, and that real freedom can only exist when citizens are healthy, educated, and free from dire poverty. So again, unlike classical liberals, which just say, well, we might need some just basics of things that, get us around in life, like free roads and utilities and some things to protect our property. Social liberalism is adapting to at least, the later half of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, and even into later 20th century. Many liberal parties, like the Liberal Party of Canada, and a lot of the Democrats in the United States, although not all of them, but many of them would probably feel at home within this category, that they're social liberals. And so now, instead of just providing for property and having markets and deregulations, well, it says here we need healthy citizens. Well, what does that mean? I'm sure most of you all remember in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we had those food pyramids. Now they didn't, or the Canada Food Guide didn't end up being very well because it was funded by the wheat industry and the meat industry and the egg industry. And of course, they told us to eat more of their products than we should have. But there is that promotion of being healthy. The idea of education is one of those things that began in the Western world, or again, I'm not sure about the Eastern world, but we can say the Western world. Certainly in the later half of the 19th century, public education was first brought to us by the Prussians in during the Napoleonic War. In the United States, there was a gentleman named Horace Mann who promoted free public education, and many, many others. So that is one of the idea of why we have schooling and mandatory attendance and so forth. And then free from poverty. Well, what does that mean? Of course, it means that we need to have more welfare. Social liberals believe that this freedom, so again, the freedom of to be healthy, educated, and free from poverty, can be ensured when governments guarantee the right to education. So again, this is where we're going to go from K to 8, and then from 9 to 12, and then some will argue maybe that there needs to be college and university free in some cases, or very low cost. Healthcare, universal healthcare comes in here. I mean, imagine, I know in the United States, healthcare can be very tricky to navigate and to get, whereas in Canada, it's like kind of the opposite. Also, a living wage, right? There needs to be maybe some kind of minimum wage, enough for us to live on and pay our rent and so forth, because those things increase our liberty. Now, classical liberals will say no, because that's the government coming in and making coercion. But social liberals will say that it's a necessary thing. In addition to all of those things, it says here there's other responses like laws against discrimination in housing and employment. So imagine, people need to live somewhere. Well, imagine if are going through this classical liberal utopia and you're part of a minority group and you can't get rent because your minority group is discriminated against or your sexuality group is discriminated against. So there has to be laws because we know people will discriminate, regardless of not whether there are laws, but at least if there are laws, then the individual has the right, to due process and so forth. Looking about things like pollution. Well, again, I mean, we all breathe the same air. Classical liberals had a problem with the environment, right? A lot of times before there were environmental regulations, especially throughout the 19th and 20th centuries and earlier, people were dying prematurely. So social liberals would argue a better environment gives us more liberty. And of course, welfare, and then it says usually supported by a progressive tax system. One moment. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. So the progressive tax. So the idea that those who earn more will pay a higher percentage than those who earn less. It'll be pumped back into the system through redistribution to make sure that we have all of these programs. And again, I know a lot of people will say this is not a good idea, and a lot of people will prefer, a de-escalation of these kinds of things because we may have, education, but now people are saying education can be political. We have universal healthcare, but in some places like Canada, the wait times are incredibly long. Living wages, a lot of economists will say if you increase the minimum wage, it actually costs jobs for people who want to enter the market. You have things within, housing discrimination, telling, you know, um, landlords and so forth who they can and can't have in their own homes, and there's all these unintended consequences and on and on and on. But again, this is the idea, at least of social liberalism, is that these are necessary regardless of their unintended consequences, because liberty doesn't just mean property and living with the most basic fundamentals of public services, that we need to be healthy, we need to be educated, we all contribute to our society, and there's got to be some level of social justice, which means, and the definition of social justice, by the way, is that those that may have more income at the top will have to then, you know, uh, provide to the people who don't, in order for the people who don't to have a minimum level of decency and so forth, and not be just like taken advantage of and so forth. Hey Brian, how are you? Good afternoon. Well, good afternoon to you. Good evening here. I appreciate you being on, and again, I do want to do a collab with you, so let's get on that soon, Brian. Pussycat mind meld, my mind to your mind. Good afternoon. I'm listening half an ear, doing some cleaning. Well, that's all I can ask for. So I appreciate it. And hello. So again, we have all these parallels, but just think of most center left, parties in North America, Democratic parties. A lot of them are built on this. Liberal Party, probably a lot of Labor parties, Liberal Democrats, probably in the UK, and so forth. So whenever you think of social liberals, this is kind of the basic idea. So on one hand, we have this one, which tends to be, again, kind of older. Well, we have all these freedoms and we have a very minimal state. We're focusing on liberty. This one, in social liberalism, takes that fundamental foundation of the classical liberalism and then adds some stuff because, again, the idea is we need to be healthy, we need to be educated, and we can't have we can't have poverty, because if we're living unhealthy, uneducated, poor, we have terrible pollution and stuff, it actually does contribute against our liberty. Okay. And another one here's a very interesting one. I think if you're in Europe, you probably know this one a little bit more. This tends to be a little bit odd in North America, but it's what is conservative liberalism, and that almost seems like kind of a contradiction, kind of an oxymoron, because we are going to get into conservatism afterwards. But conservative liberalism is a thing, and there are some, center right liberals, I guess you could say, center right liberals, almost like classical liberals are sort of center right liberals. Um, and they do exist for example, in the European Parliament, and there are parties in European countries that are called conservative liberals. So conservative liberalism is a variant of liberalism representing the right wing of the liberal movement, so mostly center right, and it combines liberal values with conservative stances. Unlike liberal conservatives, which is also something, however, who tend to be more committed to authority, tradition, and the establishment of religion, a conservative liberal, they support the separation of church and state. And then it says here it also differs from libertarianism in that it is far less radical in its economic program and in its support for an active defense policy and military intervention. So I guess we have both conservative liberals and liberal conservatives, just like we have democratic socialists and social democrats, which I'm going to get into when we talk about that stuff. And it's almost like we're splitting hairs, and maybe it's a little semantics, but you can see here that it tends to be more of a center right liberal who believes in the values that I mentioned before, but they're going to also have some conservative stances. Whereas liberal conservatives more have to do with tradition and religion, and they tend to be the liberal conservatives will be actually the most left of the conservatives. These are the more right wing of the liberals. And then you'll see here that one of the things with conservative liberals is that they support an active defense policy and military intervention, which is going to be quite important when we get into conservatism, especially what's called paleo conservatism, which is going to be coming up in a few slides. Okay, so again, this is a bit of a split hairs one. It's a bit odd because they seem contradictory and because they have these dual roles: conservative, liberal, liberal, conservative. Um, but you can sort of see what they mean here. And I will message you. I will message you on Facebook, Brian. Next one, economic liberalism. Okay. So, um, specifically, economic liberalism is the economic theory of classical liberalism, which was developed during the Enlightenment, again, 17th, 18th century, by Adam Smith, which advocates a minimal interference by government in the economy. So, when I went back and talked about previously classical liberalism, when we talked about things like non-intervention, let me go back here. You can see here classical liberalism holds that the only freedom is freedom from coercion, and that state intervention in the economy is a coercive power. Okay. So this is where these ideas are coming from, and this is called classical economics. So, or classical liberalism, classical economics by Adam Smith. Okay. You can read his work in On the Wealth of Nations. Um, on the Wealth of Nations, which some people love, some people don't like, you know, at least because before capitalism, and we can argue the merits of capitalism, we can argue the merits of this kind of capitalism without regulation. We can, look at social liberalism. We can look at the what's called social democracy, progressive capitalism, and so forth. And some people don't like it because it's private property. I understand. And when we take a look at socialism, we're going to look at some of those criticisms too, especially of private property and what that means versus personal property versus public property, etc. However, um, one thing that it did do is it got people out of mercantilism, and mercantilism was what happened before capitalism. And again, going back to a system that was very elitist, very authoritarian, and it gave individuals, and again, when I say individuals, I mean white men, okay? It did give white men trickled down, which is not a term I like, but whatever, later on, okay, which we have to note when we talk about voting rights and we talk about the rights of constitutional rights and so forth. As we did last week, we got to make the caveat that not everyone was able to vote. You know, if you were a descendant of an African slave, took a little time for you to vote. If you were a woman, it took a little time to if you were voting and so forth. But at least in this time, the very strong authoritarian type of mercantilism was pretty much disestablished, and a lot of individuals, meaning white men, white European men, were then able to, own factories and businesses and whatever and so forth. So that's at least the idea. And again, I know it's not without fault. There's a lot of faults there, but that's at least, what I was taught when learning economic history. It says here, libertarianism, which I can get into, neoliberalism, which I'll get into, and some schools of conservatism, in particular, liberal conservatism, are referred to as economic liberal. And just think of this as minimal intervention into especially minimal government intervention in the economy. So when we talk about things like deregulation, getting rid of the red tape of government, things like this, we are going to talk about economic liberalism. It means essentially to liberate, right, economics, liberate the economy. And that, of course, comes with a lot of unforeseen circumstances. One of them being what is referred to as neoliberalism. I think a lot of people probably, if you study like the 1980s, if you study Reaganomics, if you've studied Margaret Thatcher, which it says here, you will know, maybe you won't know the term neoliberalism, but you probably heard of the kind of the 1980s. I mentioned the word trickle down economics, also called supply side economics, and so forth. There's the Chicago School of Economics, Monetary School of Economics, people like Milton Friedman, who was very popular in the late 70s and 80s, to this new economic revolution that some people are still debating on whether or not it worked. My opinion, if you want it, is it didn't work. It was something that led to more economic inequality, but there are people who disagree with that because a lot of income and wealth was created during that time, but it fell into the hands of a few people. It didn't actually trickle down. At least that's what I believe. So neoliberalism, of course, just means new liberalism, and it refers to a program of reducing trade barriers and international market restrictions while using government power to enforce foreign markets. So this was coined by people like Noam Chomsky, who's very left wing, and other, I guess you could say U.S. culture critics and so forth. A lot of people believed, Bill Clinton was involved in this, and even Jean Chrétien and in Canada, who I mentioned before. And it was that idea. It was mostly deregulation. It was, getting rid of the red tape and so forth. I remember learning about this through Margaret Thatcher, who once said in Parliament that the trouble with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money, and so on and so on. And so, if you've ever heard of these things, if you grew up in the 80s, but especially I would say between like 1978 to probably like 2000, I guess, it's hard to really know, or more, probably even to into like 2008 during the crisis, during the Great Recession. That's probably one of the considered to be the neoliberal kind of era, and a lot of people blame neoliberal policies for the tanking of the housing market in 2008, because it was a lot of deregulation of things like Glass-Steagall and whatever. So this is that kind of idea. So this is a form of liberalism, and what it really means is we see here, in some ways, it is a modern attempt championed by conservatives like Ronald Reagan, 1911-2004, and Margaret Thatcher, 1925-2013, since the 70s, to revert to a pure classical liberalism. So the neo part, of course, means new, and the liberalism is the economic liberalism, or the classical liberalism. And so in economics, there is classical economics, which we learn through economic histories and so forth, which is that Adam Smith. That's called classical economics. And so that was the idea, was to bring back that classical liberal economic theory that I mentioned here, right? Bring this back that I just mentioned into the modern times, which was the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, as opposed to this view, which was, I would say, the more 19th and 20th century, which at least had more social programs and so forth. So it's the new liberalism, okay? And that's really this kind of thing. Ross Perot was against it. Can you hear that sucking sound? That is our country going down the drain. Yeah, he was very much an economic protectionist, and very much a populist. A lot of Trump's policies were from Ross Perot. Tariffs, which, according to most economists, means that the consumer in America will be paying more money, but whatever. You know, and so forth, lowering taxes and whatnot. So yeah, Ross Perot had that you might call it an economic protectionist and populist stance. And yeah, he was obviously in opposition to people like Clinton for sure. Said the person that made his most money off government contracts. Yeah, exactly. Reminds me of people, yeah, who hate the government but are on Social Security. So, well, you can still hate the government and be on Social Security, but your welfare is kind of tied to the government anyway. Doesn't matter. Okay, let's look at some other types of liberalism before we get into conservatism. The first is national liberalism. This is what I talked about last week. So, the national liberalism is a variant of liberalism commonly found in several European countries in the 19th, 20th century, which combine nationalism with policies derived from economic liberalism. So, when I was talking again about the 1948 revolution, I said it was a very liberal revolution in the sense that men, again, non-property owning men got the right to vote. There were constitutions. Jewish communities were kind of getting equal rights as well, especially to votes and so forth. So this is what we refer to as national liberalism. And of course, the economic policies at that time were not yet part of social liberalism. That wouldn't happen until the middle to the later part of the 19th century with people like Bismarck, because Bismarck, and I will do um, a PowerPoint on the unification of Germany. He would actually, in order to keep socialists at bay from revolting and making revolutions in Germany, he gave things like public accident insurance and things like this to the socialists. And so a lot of people say the first welfare state was actually like 1871 to 1880s in Germany. But that's really where social liberalism, at least in practicalism, starts, which is not until the later part of the 19th century in Europe. So national liberalism is what we mainly talked about last week. And then it says here, this one is funny. Ordo liberalism is a mid 20th century school of liberalism developed mainly in Germany, emphasizing the need for the state to ensure that free market produces results close to its theoretical potential. I mean, again, this seems a little obscure, I guess. This is the idea that, like, in order for there to be a truly free market, then the free market and people must be free of coercion. A libertarian view of the free market is that and the classical liberal view is that the government interference is coercion. But this is the kind of view that if the government doesn't interfere, okay, then other people will coerce the market. And this is kind of an interesting thing too, because it's a big philosophical debate. If the government, for example, doesn't create laws that punish businesses and corporations from lying in their advertisement, yes, it's the free speech of the corporation. And if you buy a product that ends up not working, um, that's not the free market according to this kind of thing. It's like reducing the coercion within the market by setting laws and so forth like that. So anyway, that's just kind of a bit of an obscure one, but anyway, that I just thought that was interesting to look at. So now we're going to get to conservatism. And as I do that, I just want to see where we're at, where everyone's at right now. Ross Perot. We got Brian. I'll message you, as I said before. Peter, thanks. You're very active here. I appreciate it. Um, okay. Well, anyway, I'll go back onto conservatism. So conservatism, I only have a couple of slides, and again, this is I want to say that this stuff is based on the things that are on philosophybasics.com. This is where I'm getting my definitions. This is where we're breaking down our ideas. So if you want to go over there and so forth, they have quite a lot of really interesting articles, and I always use them because I think they are the best. So anyway, what is conservatism, right? Conservatism again starts around the Enlightenment, and one of its founders is a gentleman named Edmund Burke. I believe he's British. And to conserve, right, is the root word of conservatism. So, what are they conserving? And I know that one of the most conservative definitions of conservatism, not ironically, is to conserve the traditions of essentially the status quo because um, and social institutions that were created by the status quo. So we have liberals, right, who believe in the liberation between us and authority. When we get into socialism and like revolution, we're talking about completely destroying social institutions and starting again. Okay. You'll find this with policing, like defund the police is like, let's burn policing to the ground, defund it, and then start again with some like a new version, a completely different version, or marriage, okay, or something like this, where what we're doing now isn't working. So we have to literally get rid of the whole thing, okay, and start again. A liberal would say, no, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. What works, we'll stick with it, and we'll change what doesn't work. And conservatives say, no, because we've had the institutions like marriage and policing and so forth, and religion and so forth for so long. There has to be something about it that works, and we're going to hold on to that, and we're going to conserve those institutions. And that was really an Edmund Burkean type of conservatism. But of course, conservatives would favor tradition because the idea is that the traditions have been around for a long time. I know this being Jewish. I'm part of the conservative Jewish movement. Well, we're not politically conservative, but we do believe that, it's been thousands of years, or at least, a long time since people have been practicing our traditions. And there's something about that that's really interesting. So we're sort of conserving those traditions. Now, of course, we also have to change them, and there's a whole bunch of nuances within that, but that's at least the idea. So, we've had, lots of institutions over the past thousands of years that are still with us in many cases. Some that have changed, but a lot that have stayed with us. So maybe there's something inherently valuable about that. And we shouldn't just, destroy those things. It's obviously critical of proposals for radical social change. They tend to believe slower changes, if any, in our society. A liberal might say slow changes, evolutionary changes, like incrementalist changes. A radical will say no, fast, rip off the band aid, right? A liberal might say, let's tear off the band aid very slowly. And a conservative would say, well, hey, listen, the band aid's not hurting anybody and it's been there for a while. Let's keep it. Preserving the status quo, or again, reforming society slowly, is an inherited trait in conservatism. Changes should be organic, not revolutionary. It advocates the preservation of personal wealth and private ownership, and emphasizes things like self reliance and individualism. Well, let's look at those things. In a conservative tradition, personal wealth, this is where we get this kind of esteem for the business person, the CEO, the business owner who is successful, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, the immigrant that came to America with nothing and now owns a business and is a multimillionaire. Let's talk about Elon Musk, whom I don't necessarily like, but he was born in South Africa. His mother is Canadian. He lived in Canada for a long time, moved to the United States. Now he's a billionaire. There's a lot of rags to riches stories like that. Lots of athletes go through that. How many athletes do we know that come from impoverished projects, especially those who play basketball? And this is not to be stereotypical about that, but we can point to a lot of athletes in all kinds of sports whom come from the projects, or they come from an impoverished place, whether they're white or African American or Latino. There's a lot of baseball players that come from Latin America, and they come to America as immigrants. They play, 20 years or 10 years in a professional sport. They get their citizenship, and they become very wealthy. So there's something that conservatives will say, well, they did that, you know. It wasn't necessarily a social thing, it was a personal thing. Of course, private ownership is capitalism. It means owning your own private property, which tends to mean things like businesses, corporations, and things like this. Again, emphasizing self-reliance, even though some people might need welfare, there are some communities in the United States, Canada, and so forth that will not take handouts. A lot of ethnic communities don't like to take charities. I know um, anyway, there's a lot of people in certain communities won't. I don't want to name anyone just in case I misname and so forth. But you could probably understand that there's certain people who come to America and they want to get a job. They don't necessarily want to, rely on handouts, quote unquote, which personally I don't think there's anything wrong with, but that's maybe a cultural idea. And then again, emphasizing that individualism, that idea that I'm the one who's getting myself from the bottom to the top, and if I'm not doing it, I need to do more. We look at more punitive towards criminals. So this is the idea of punishment of criminals as opposed to rehabilitation. Liberals would be more interested in how do we rehabilitate criminals back into society. So if somebody stole $40,000 worth of electronics, that's a social problem according to someone who's a liberal. So how do we in prison? How do we make sure that that person doesn't go back into prison, which is called recidivism? Give them an education, give them job skills, and then when they go out into the real world, they're rehabilitated. Conservatives say no, they're born criminals in some cases, and whatever's in their criminal brain, they need to be punished, and the punishment will make them think twice. Says here tends to hold more orthodox religious views. Of course, if you are a religious conservative, that is true. There are, however, secular conservatives or atheists who are conservatives. But if you are one, then yes, that is true. A conservative Christian. I know conservative Jew, we tend to be orthodox, tend to hold those views, but that is also true. And it says they're often more ethnocentric. That means that within their ethnicity, they're centered towards their ethnicity. They tend to maybe not be as cosmopolitan or multicultural as others. And then it says hostile towards homosexuals and other minority groups, which is certainly a possibility for at least certain kinds of conservatives, although not all kinds of conservatives, as we're going to delve into in a moment. Let me see here. Ah, really? Snowstorm. Jeez Louise. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, buffalo and snow, let me tell you. All right, here's a couple of types here. I have two slides on the types. So the first one is cultural conservatism. So cultural conservatism is a philosophy that supports preservation of the heritage of a nation or culture, sometimes the language traditions, usually by the adaptation of norms handed down from the past. And when someone considers themselves to be more of a cultural conservative, then again, we're looking at things like in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, there are these social norms, there are these cultural norms. Okay. There are things that people do, right? There are actions, there are holidays, there are monarchies in some cases. There are just things that people do because they're Canadians or because they're Australian or because they're Hungarians or whatever. And I tend to find it here in Hungary, just by example, the language is a big one, especially also in places like Germany. This idea that people should be speaking, especially outside, especially in school, a proper use of the language. And that tends to be kind of the idea. And of course, conserving your heritage, conserving your nation, conserving your culture is a cultural conservative. And a lot of those that are culturally conservatives may not be in the other two categories. So, one, for example, might be very culturally conservative, but also very open to the LGBTQ movement, minorities, etc. It really just depends on the person. So just think about that. So, every country has social norms. Every country has, some people have cultural politeness like we do in Canada. Some people have more cultural aggressiveness, and so that's the idea, conserving those traditions from the past, which come through our culture, especially again the language and the conserving of our language. And again, I find in a lot of English speaking countries there is this reaction to the more cultural progressives who are multicultural, multilinguistic, cosmopolitan, and then those that say, no, you have to speak English, English in this situation, English in that situation. Stand when the national anthem is played, put your hand on your heart. Monarchists or loyalist people in Canada, as opposed to Republicans, meaning people who are loyal to the monarchy, as opposed to people who believe that Canada and other commonwealths should, split from the monarchy. And that's kind of the ideas behind that. We then get into social conservatives. And a lot of people, I think, when they think of conservatives, they think of social conservatives, especially the next one, religious conservatives. So, social conservatives are a subset of cultural conservatives where the norms may be moral. So, when we think sometimes of, especially like very hard right wing Christians, like the religious right, they're socially conservative and they also are religious conservatives. So, they would oppose homosexuality. They would want, for example, more religion, and this is, we're going to get into the next example, in secular society. This is here the covering of women's faces. That tends to be, of course, more in the Muslim world, but also in the Jewish world. We both have social and religious conservatives who believe that women should be in a subservient role and so forth, which I absolutely oppose. Those are the Orthodox and so forth. We then get into religious conservatism, right? Seeks to preserve the teachings of a particular religious ideology, and especially by making it part of the law. Religious conservatives may promote broad campaigns of a return to traditional values, or they may go the radical route, looking to preserve the belief in its original and pristine form. So again, think of like theocracies, think of the old time, think of the Seven Mountains Christians, the evangelical Christians in the Republican Party, or we have social conservatives, of course, in Canada. We have a Bible Belt in Canada. You have a Bible Belt all over. You have a Bible Belt in the Netherlands. These are the people that tend to, they don't want women to choose to have an abortion. Tends to be, the quote unquote pro-life movement tends to be more socially conservative. So these, and they can be for religious reasons. Of course, they're not always for religious reasons. They could be for cultural reasons. They could be for secular reasons, but for the most part, they are. So when I think of religious and social conservatism in my own religion, I think of like the very, like, ultra orthodox, whom have a very strong division between men and women, male and females. They're not open to LGBTQ Jewish people. They tend to be against Christians and Muslims. They tend to hold very uh, black versus white, us versus them views of the Jewish world and the Gentile world. and they tend to be very traditional, and that can also go across to Christianity, to Islam, to Hinduism. Especially in India, there's a lot of Hindu nationalism, for example, Buddhist nationalism, and on and on and on. So that's what I would think when I think of those particular things. And finally, the last slide, we're going to talk about different ones. So now we have fiscal conservatism. And fiscal conservatism will overlap with things like classical liberalism, economic liberalism, and even neoliberalism. It says here is the economic philosophy of prudence in government spending and debt, arguing that a government does not have the right to run up large debts and then throw the burden to the taxpayers. So again, when we're maybe thinking about things like Reagan and so forth, Ross Perot, they were definitely fiscal conservatives, and also a lot of libertarians will call themselves socially liberals and fiscally conservative. That tends to be a marketing thing that they had about 10, 15 years ago. So that's the idea, being more fiscally responsible. So the idea is not to spend too much money. After this, we have paleoconservatives, which I mentioned before. This is a moderate to extreme form of conservatism, popular in the Bible Belt of the USA, which emphasize religious heritage, national and Western identity, tradition, civil society. However, it's here anti-interventionist policies and classical federalism. It specifically opposes illegal immigration, communism, authoritarianism, social democracy, and entitlement programs. This form of conservatism was very popular just after the Second World War and until the 1970s with the rise of the religious right, neoliberalism, social conservatism, and the religious conservatism that we talked about here. So, roughly for about 30 years, let's say 1945 to 75, the religious right were a lot more anti or non-interventionist. Okay. When we talk about the Cold War, a lot of these individuals throughout the 50s and 60s did not want the US to get involved in overthrowing governments. They were more, isolated. And so, yes, they had these illegal immigration. They didn't like Mexicans, of course. They didn't want Vietnamese people to come into the United States. There was the anti-communism at the time, anti-socialism, this kind of anti-entitlement programs that are very popular with more of the economic right wing. But the one thing was on foreign policy, that the United States was not supposed to be the policeman, quote unquote, of the world. The next one and our last one here talks about the new conservatism. Neoconservatism is also called neocons, which I'm sure a lot of people remember. Specifically, I remember the neocon phenomenon because this became very popular after 9/11. And in this movement, okay, emerged first of all, right, in the United States, in opposition to the liberalism of the 60s, and it's very specifically interventionist foreign policies. It says free trade and free markets and a general disapproval of counterculture. So while it became very popular in the 1960s, and it was very active in the 50s, 60s, 70s with all of these overthrowing of governments, most conservatives didn't like that. And then after the counterculture revolution and into the 70s, the religious right became very popular, and social conservatism and religious conservatism, which then coupled with neoliberalism throughout the 80s, became a very big institution and political movement within the United States and the Republican Party. And so by the time 9/11 happened, neoliberalism was also on its way kind of out. So you can maybe argue that, but neoconservatism was on its way in because then America started to become, the policeman, quote unquote, of the world. And of course, most people believed that America should have gone to Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden, but a lot of people believed that neocons like George W. Bush, John Ashcroft, and Dick Cheney, and other advisors to George W. Bush, who were in fact neoconservatives, pushed the Bush administration into going into Iraq. And so that was something that was, very much a popular idea at the time. And a lot of these neocon thinkers, some people would accuse John McCain of being also one, and John Bolton, and a whole bunch of others like them. Whether or not they are, again, that's not up to me. In my opinions, I certainly have, my opinion on all this kind of stuff. Hey, Shell, another one of my Mark Apostles has arrived. I appreciate it. Don't worry about being late. You can always go back and look on the replay. We're just about to close up here, but those are the end of my presentation here. So I hope everybody found that informative. And again, I always like to give a big thanks to the people at Philosophy Basics, because these are where I get my definitions. Of course, I add my own commentary, my own thoughts after that, and try to break down. And I hope it was informative, and just to know, like, whatever subset that you want to believe in, liberalism, conservatism, regardless, have had a very tremendous influence on current politics. And even us moving out of those more authoritarian, mercantile, monarchistic, even conservatism and liberalism has helped, really shaped our modern politics, for better or for worse. There are obviously criticisms against each. There are also, people's personal opinions on each. I certainly have mine, but, they might not be perfect, but at least when it comes to things like democracy, and when it comes to things like, shaping our modern political ways and political thinking, both of those things have done quite a bit. And they also are considered the most moderate, okay? Because we're going to get into like socialism and later, libertarianisms, forms of nationalism. They tend to be a little bit more radical. Well, certainly, at least liberalism is kind of center left, and conservatism can be sort of center right. And of course, there's more left and there's more right going on that we can talk about at another time. But thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. As I said, I do hope you learned something. Hope so. If you haven't or anything, please let me know. Um, but I want to thank everyone for their attention. I want to thank everyone who's here. Our Saturday night, or Saturday evening for me anyway. Saturday night, Saturday evening streams tend to get the most views. Although I do also love our Wednesdays, because it's just me sort of thinking about stuff. And I know people love that because you get to vote on it. So again, I appreciate everyone being here so much. So just before I go, just before we conclude, I want to again go to the calendar and just let you know that the next live stream that I'm going to do is on Wednesday, December the 4th, or the 4th of December, and there will be no poll. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about different schools of history, or different varieties of history, because that was what lost the poll for, for last week, when we talked about Scientology reform. So that's going to be the topic. Of course, I will give a post in my community tab, so please look at my community tab for those, for those for that statement, I guess, or for that announcement. 1 week from today will be the 7th of December. We're going to probably talk, I think, about socialism, and maybe we'll talk about capitalism, depending on, how much there is, because there's quite a bit of it. But I'm thinking maybe we'll do both, and it'll be something similar to this, where we get our, stuff from Philosophy Basics, and we'll go through them and we'll dissect them. On the 11th, as I mentioned earlier, it is the 1 year anniversary of the passing of our friend Doug Scott Kramer. And I'm going to have sort of a wake. I want to say, I want to celebrate his life, and what he meant to me and our friendship, even though I only knew him for maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years. I want to sort of talk to you about some of the stuff that we had planned to do in the future, some of my thoughts on the videos that we made together, and just overall the things that I learned from him, because he definitely had an impact, even though, again, I only knew him for a short amount of time. He had a very tremendous impact on my life. I also want to tell you, too, about two other ex members who were, men, who sort of were, I guess you could say, older brother figures in many ways, and that's Gary Scarf and Rob Robinson. I want to sort of get into that and tell you about them and why, sort of having an older male figure. Um, I talked about this with Doug, so we'll get into that in a couple weeks from now. On the 14th, we'll have another PowerPoint, and I think on the 18th, we'll have some kind of, again, poll that I'll put up. And then after that, we're on holidays, and I'll be back in the New Year's. Um, Thank you, Power Lines. Oh, thank you. There you are. Hey, thank you so much. Good one. I learned even remotely as conservative as I said it before today. That's good. Yep, very different to the different forms of history. Thank you, guys. Pussycat's here. Thank you so much. Hey, Power Lines and Pussycat. That's great. Great to see both of you. Thank you so much. So yeah, so that's going to be the calendar for the next couple weeks. I'm going to go on now and do the time codes. I know the time codes are not on, but I'm going to do them. I'm going to hop on now and do them. Please, again, for any announcements, always check my community tab, but there will be no poll. Just know that we'll talk about history. And other than that, I'm not too much sure. I mean, please, again, please like the video. I've been really trying to get more subscribers. So I've been posting my videos different places. Some of them get taken off. I've been contacting some people to go on their channels, but sometimes I don't get answers. And I've been trying for months now to get on Aaron's channel. So maybe hopefully you guys can nudge him in the right direction. But he's busy. But I would love to go on his. I'll probably do Marilyn's again, in the next little while because she always has me on. I'm gonna see if I can get some people to come on when we talk about Doug, although I don't know if that will or will not happen. So who knows? But regardless, obviously I'd like more views and more subscribers. So please like this video if you haven't already. Please subscribe to my channel. Did you sign up with Kelly Copter? Do you mean like become a member? Because I'm not sure if I'm a member, but yeah, I will probably just message her or text her to see if she's going to do anything for um, Doug's thing. And then, of course, the last one is we have the chatathon, which is starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Right now, should be 4:22, so in a few hours. And tomorrow, I'm going to get up and I'm going to come as Pete Pete Panzerotti, which I haven't done for a little while, and I'm going to spend some time. So yeah. Oh yes, and yes, Kelly Copter's Google form. I filled it out. So hopefully she'll get back to me and we'll do it. But yes, I did. I filled it out. And then the chatathon again. Please, people, go to the chatathon. That should be fun. Please support Chad. Chad is the #1 Mark Postle, and I mentioned this earlier because he was the first person to subscribe to my channel. So he is the first Mark Postle, and we still have 2 to 12 which is in no particular order, but there are a few of them. Shell is a Mark Postle, Pizza Mark Postle, Irish is a Mark Postle. We got a few people going. And yes, I'm gonna rest my voice. I've had a bit of a sore throat the past couple of weeks. I've got some water here. And yeah, we're gonna talk about pizza. We're gonna talk about fraud. I'm gonna do my Chicago accent after I rest my voice a little bit. I'm gonna throw on my gray flat cap backwards, my sunglasses, which are prescription, by the way, and I've got that beautiful Adidas jacket that I know everyone loves. Um, having to type with your left hand, I know. Was going to say too, Shell. I hope you're feeling better. I know that really really sucks. Shell had hurt her hand recently, so let's all get some good thoughts, good vibes, prayers, whatever you do. Make sure that Shell's hand heals and she can go to work as soon as she can. So please, again, the last thing to do, check out the chatathon in just a few hours. Thank you for watching this video. Please like if you haven't already. Please subscribe to my channel. Please share this video if you would like as well. And as always, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.